生きよえと土見て浮かぶ落ち足に戦についえ裏がれるかな。
Hello everybody and welcome to today's video. Okay, so we're going to be talking about Ghost of Tsushima and history today. The embargo on the game has finally lifted. I've got a review up on digitallydownloaded.net and it is a massive review, to give you fair warning. It is the biggest review I've ever written. It is 5,500 words long. I have a lot to say about that game, and while it's not all positivity, what I will say is that I do think the game is a lot of fun, and I really hope that people read my review with an open mind and keep that in context. I genuinely enjoyed playing it, so while I'm critical of the game, I'm also very much giving it the respect of being a artwork, a genuine artwork. If it was just a game to me, if it was just content, there's no way that I would have felt the need to write so much about it. I did mostly leave one thing out of the review though, and that is because I wanted to discuss it in the context of this video, and that's on the history side of things. Basically, why did Sucker Punch decide to make a game from a very old part of Japanese history, which isn't all that well known within Japan itself? From my experience, the Japanese are very aware of the Mongol invasions, of course. It is a very important part of their history, and they're very aware of the way that it ended, the typhoon that sunk the Mongol ships, which ended up being called kamikaze. But when it comes to specific details about the invasions, the Japanese people are much more familiar with periods like the Sengoku or modern era. So again, the question is, why did Sucker Punch decide to make a game about this particular part of history? What's more though, why did Sucker Punch focus on what is just a footnote within that historical event? There were actually 2 invasions by the Mongols in total. For the first, Tsushima was almost nothing against the full invasion. Most of the action occurred on the mainland, and really the action that was on Tsushima was really only notable because it was the first point that the Mongols invaded. For the second invasion by the Mongols, there is almost no records whatsoever left. It is literally a footnote in history in that instance. So I'm going to do something with this video. There aren't many English records available on the Mongol invasions of Japan, but there is one quite comprehensive book on the overall campaign by a guy called Stephen Turnbull, and the book is called The Mongol Invasions of Japan 1274 and 1281. It's not the most imaginative title, but the book is about 100 pages long, and it is the most comprehensive and detailed account that I've come across. You can get this book quite readily on Amazon, and you can buy it on your Kindle or e-reader if you prefer to read your books that way. It is a very accessible, very easy to read book, and very much worthwhile if you are interested in learning about the history of these 2 invasions. So what I'm going to do for this video is read the entirety of what that book actually talks about with regards to Tsushima. It's only about 2 pages worth of content or material, which is exactly the point that I'm going to be making about Sucker Punch soon. So here we go. Here is my reading of the couple of pages within this book that deal with the invasion of Tsushima. The invasion fleet set sail from Korea on the 3rd day of the 10th lunar month, 2 November 1274. And the first Mongol invasion of Japan began with an attack on the island of Tsushima, which was reached after a short crossing from Korea. Tsushima consists of 2 main islands divided by a narrow strait, and the Mongol attacks were directed at 4 places on the western sides of the 2 islands. 2 landings were made on the northern island, 1 was launched into the strait between the islands, while the major assault was made in the Sasura area on the southern island, where the sea entered a deep gulf, and at its mouth was a sheltered sandy beach called Komoda. The So-Shi Kafu, a history of the So family of Tsushima, tells us that the attack was launched by 8,000 Mongols, transported on 900 ships. During the evening of 4 November, the invasion fleet was spotted in the sea off Sasura, which gave time for the deputy Jito of Tsushima, So Sukekuni, I hope I pronounced that right, to organize a hasty defense. In this, he was helped by a very fortunate omen. To the contemporary Japanese, the battlefield was one very important area where the kami, the gods, became involved with the affairs of men, and no kami was more respected to the samurai than Hachiman, the god of war. On the very day that the Mongols were approaching, says the Hachiman Gudokan, the shrine of Hachiman on Tsushima mysteriously caught fire. The blaze was quickly extinguished and saved from being an omen of bad luck when the news reached So Sukekuni that a flock of white doves had been seen settling on the roof of the shrine. The dove was a messenger of Hachiman, so the fact that Hachiman had set fire to his own shrine by this means was immediately interpreted as a warning and not a disaster. So Sukekuni's command consisted of 80 mounted samurai and their followers, whom he had led over a mountain pass during the night to take up position at the beach of Komoda in Sasura, where they proceeded to wait until the dawn. The Mongols landed on Komoda beach at about 2 o'clock on the morning of November 5, and both sides were engaged in fierce fighting from about 4 o'clock onwards. As the fighting began, 2 men took a boat and managed to slip through the midst of the Mongol ships to take a message to Dazaifu that the war had started. An interpreter had been taken along by So Sukekuni in order to gauge the intentions of the incoming fleet, but the Mongol army had no desire to enter into negotiations and instead loosed arrows as over 1,000 Mongol warriors made their initial landfall on Japanese soil. For the first time, the contrasting tactics of the Mongol and Japanese army came into conflict. Sukekuni immediately returned fire, and many Mongols were killed by the excellent archery of both Sukekuni and the samurai under his command. One of Sukekuni's closest followers perished at the end of a hard fight when he broke his sword and was knocked down by a stone, probably thrown by a catapult from the enemy force. A grove of trees had conveniently disordered the Mongol ranks, and at least one senior Mongol officer had become his victim. But the enthusiastic lieutenant became isolated from his comrades, and after a shower of arrows hit him, 3 of which pierced his chest. In spite of all their bravery, because of the numerical superiority of the enemy, Sukekuni's men, lord and retainers alike were overwhelmed by the sheer strength of the Mongol horde. Over half of Sukekuni's direct followers had been killed on the beach, and his force now was reduced to 60 comparatively weak warriors. Following their complete victory, the Mongol army set fire to the buildings around Sasura and slaughtered most of the inhabitants. So apologies for a couple of moments of stuttering through that reading, but that is it. That is the entirety of what is covered with regards to the conflict between the people of Tsushima and the Mongols in the first invasion. And remember, the second invasion didn't have any records survive. There's nothing that we really know about that beyond what has passed down in legend in the years since. That is it. That is the history of Tsushima and the Mongol armies. So while it's feasible that Sucker Punch did find more detailed records than what I have access to, it's unlikely that they went to the effort to research that based on what we actually see in the game and the way that it explores the history of the period. In short, having played the full game, that record is about what I would have expected in terms of the amount of research that they've actually done. Really, the only scene in the entire game that looks and feels like it came from the book is the opening scene where a bunch of samurai go on a death charge to meet the invading Mongols as they land on the beach, which is all fairly authentic, and as I mentioned in my review, that moment, that opening cutscene in the game, actually gave me hope that there was going to be some real historical context to this game. Unfortunately, it didn't follow on beyond there. Beyond that, based on the scene actually being fairly accurate to the accounts, I do suspect that the people at Sucker Punch read this book in particular, but I don't think they actually read further than it. I really don't think that there's any further historical details in there that they've gone and researched up in the making of this game. Regardless of how much research they've actually done, though, it's a simple fact that the mainland invasion has so much more written about it. And again, this raises the question, why Tsushima? Why deliberately pick a part of history that has been almost lost to time and has very little by way of historical record remaining. I do have some theories. Firstly, perhaps Sucker Punch thought that by choosing an unknown period of history, they would get away with a lack of authenticity. After all, it is harder to challenge something when the evidence to the contrary just isn't there. But if that's the case, it's really strange that the developer went to such lengths to introduce inauthentic elements that we can definitely demonstrate. For example, there is haiku in the game, but haiku as a poetry form didn't appear in Japan for a couple of hundred years after the events of the Mongol invasions. Sucker Punch themselves have also admitted to using much later weapons and armor design as the basis of their armor and weapons in-game, because the actual armor worn by the samurai during the Mongol invasions was pretty dull. So it would seem that Sucker Punch isn't that concerned with hiding a lack of authenticity in the game. Secondly, another theory, I guess, is that perhaps it had to do with Tsushima itself as a geography. It wasn't because of the island's geography or natural beauty, though. I know that Sucker Punch was talking up how they sent people to the island to take photos, but the reality is, as somebody who's been to Tsushima, that the end product is far too fantasized for any claims of authenticity to the island to be defensible. But as an island, Tsushima is a winner for game design. So it's actually split into two islands, both of which are fairly large and take some work to traverse, while also being bounded by a natural boundary, which is really good for an open world game. In other words, the ocean. You've got two islands, you've got the ocean, and voila, you've got your open world. If Ghosts of Tsushima had been set on the mainland, Sucker Punch would have had to have needed to throw in some artificial boundaries, which isn't the biggest issue in the world. We've certainly had open world games that have had those artificial boundaries and have been set on, continental parts of the world, but perhaps the convenience of that island was a draw when making this game, especially given the developer was not that concerned about the actual history of the period. Either way, whatever the reason is for what they've done, and this is something I've noted in my review, it does mystify me a little bit on why Sucker Punch would even base their game in a real-world history context at all if they had so little intention to actually convey historical events, people, or locations. In other words, why make a game about the Mongol invasions of Japan when you couldn't even be bothered to use real events, real people, and put a sense of real history into the game? Why do that? Why claim to make a game that's authentic if you're not going to put that authenticity in there? Why not go down the route that Sekiro, From Software's Sekiro, went and just invent a fantastic Japanese setting? It worked for Sekiro. Nobody's complaining about the lack of authenticity in Sekiro because that game just existed in its own little fantasy universe, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with doing that. But if you're going to make historical fiction, there needs to be some kind of basis in history. And to be entirely frank here, Ghost of Tsushima is absolutely terrible history. There's so little of it that's actually reflected through the game, and what is there is objectively wrong more often than it is in any way accurate or right. So my real concern with this game is that people will walk away thinking that they've learned something about samurai and feudal Japan. We know this happens, because this is exactly what happened with The Last Samurai. The film, not the game. There isn't a game, I don't think, of The Last Samurai. But the film, The Last Samurai, is every bit as bad history as Ghosts of Tsushima, and people walked away from The Last Samurai thinking that they've had a samurai experience. And we know that American game developers aren't overly concerned with the way that they treat history. Every first-person shooter set in a real-world war from EA or Activision has been deeply revisionist in its take on history. However, it is one thing to rewrite history that is still within the close enough memory that it can be challenged, and on top of that, it's something that your own country participated in. It's quite another to take the same approach to history of another country and choose both a moment of history and a historical backdrop that is virtually unknown and therefore can't be challenged. That is deeply irresponsible, and that is what Sucker Punch has done. So just to finish with the standard disclaimers, because I know there are going to be people reaching for the dislike button now, I do think that this game has a lot of merit, and I do think that there's a lot to enjoy about it. In my review, I talk about how it works as an open world action game. If Sucker Punch hadn't been so confident talking up the game as historical fiction and being inspired by Kurosawa, which is something else I discuss in depth in my review, none of my criticisms that I have for the game would have been anywhere near as relevant to the end product. And it deeply disappoints me that the team would insist on doing something that they're clearly not equipped for. This game is a lot of fun, and it would have worked a lot better if they had have divorced it from these claims that it was based in history, that it was somehow representative of Japanese samurai culture, and anything else to do with that. If they had have separated themselves from that a little bit more, then this game would have been a lot more palatable. But it is fun. I'm not a massive fan of open world games, but this one I really did have a lot of fun with it, and I had no trouble playing it to completion. So keep in mind that when you listen to my criticisms of the game, I don't think it's a perfect bit of history by any means. In fact, I think it's pretty irresponsible on that grounds, but I do think that it is a very enjoyable game. So thanks as always for tuning in, and do let me know your thoughts about Ghost of Tsushima once you've had a chance to play it. I don't know when it's actually out. I think embargo breaks a little bit before the game is released, so later on this week when you're playing it, do let me know. Once again, I would not have written 5,500 words on it in my review if I did not think that there was a lot to discuss, so I'm certainly looking forward to having those discussions. If you do enjoy my videos, please do drop me a like and a subscribe. If you enjoy the work I do, please do consider backing me on Patreon. This kind of work that I'm doing here takes up a lot of time and energy, and I would love to do a lot more of it, but I do need support in order to do that, of course. Otherwise, stay well, and we will see you at the next video.